Good evening, all. We can steal an extra minute every time, get a lot of minutes. Thank you for everyone who's made the effort to be here tonight. I appreciate you being here. We're going to study lesson 10 in our material. Tonight we're going to be talking about Jesus and his relationship with Peter. This can't be exhaustive. There's a lot about Peter in the Gospels. We're going to look at several verses. There were a lot in the material, and probably the most of any lesson. But I'm going to start with the reminder that our conversation tonight could easily turn into a conversation about Peter, and in some regard it'll have to be, right? All of these passages have to deal with Peter, but our class is about Jesus. What do we learn about Jesus in these passages? So I'm going to ask you to help me obviously we're going to have to talk about the evolution of Peter a little bit, but this class is not about the evolution of Peter. This class is about what do we learn about Jesus in these interactions. And because Peter is such a unique and prominent character, we learn a little bit about his personality and his character, but we also learn a lot, I think, about Jesus and his reaction to that, how he responded to Peter. And so as we go through class, certainly we'll talk about Peter, but this is not a class about Peter necessarily, about Peter's growth and Peter's faith and Peter's evolution as a believer. It's very much about Jesus. So we'll try to keep that in mind as we approach these verses tonight. Before we dig into any of the specific passages, I've asked Brother Matt if he would to begin us with a word of prayer. Amen. Thank you. So I hope that everyone has had a chance to look at these passages a little bit. And again, I know there were several of them. But if you studied them all and you took a few notes on them, you'll see you can kind of trace a path of Peter's life and his interaction with Jesus. And we'll do that a little bit to some extent tonight. But I guess first question, if you had to describe the relationship between Peter and Jesus, and that's largely what we're going to be talking about tonight, if you had to describe their relationship based on the passages in the study that you have done in preparation for this class, how would you describe their relationship? Touch and go, okay, back and forth a little bit, right? Wasn't always positive. That's a good place to start. Interesting point. Yes. Lovingly aggressive. Okay, explain.
Didn't hold back. Behind me, Satan made a point, but things of love and knew what Peter needed to hear and had the grace and hey, when you fall, again, you got a job to do.
Yeah.
So he just laid out some hard facts and done it with love.
Yeah. So I think what both these guys are saying, and I think they're both correct. You see in this relationship between Jesus and Peter, there are times when Jesus is extraordinarily patient and tender and affectionate. And you also see times where Jesus is pretty quick and harsh. At least, that may be the wrong word, but at least quick and to the point in his rebuke. And you see both of those, yes. Yes. And I think very patient with him. Yeah, that thread, I think, runs throughout all of these accounts. So patient with him. We'll almost skip to the end. We'll go somewhat chronological, but all the way to the end, that Satan has asked to sift you as wheat, like that. Anyway, as we get to that point, that thread of being patient with him through Peter's ups and downs in his own faith, right? And his own struggles, his own impetuousness. We definitely see that in Peter. But again, I think Jesus' response to all of that is so interesting. We often focus on Peter and how his person, but what was Jesus' constant response to that? Yes? Mm-hmm. I think that's such a good point that, Jesus is continually teaching in all of these things. And why does he seem to continually include Peter in all of these events and all of these lessons? If you go all the way back, one of the passages that we're going to look at, all the way back to Luke 5, how many times did Jesus call the disciples is somewhat a debated topic. He seems to call them in Mark 1 and then call them again in Luke 5 in two different accounts. But in Luke 5, remember that account, first 10, 11 verses of Luke chapter 5, the miraculous catch of fish. Whose boat did that happen in? Peter's boat. Isn't that interesting? When all the other examples that John mentioned, Peter seemed to always be brought. But from the very beginning, in Luke 5, it was Peter's boat. And who did he tell specifically to go throw their nets? He said to Simon, put out in the deep and let your nets down for a catch. Again, we know there's a crowd of people. We are told that in verse 1. We know that there are other disciples there. We know there are other boats there. But Jesus gets in Peter's boat and tells Peter to throw his nets out. And it is Peter who has the most, at least the one that's recorded for us, the most significant reaction to that. When the catch is brought in, what's Peter's reaction? Yeah. How often do we see that, right, in Scripture when somebody's confronted with the enormity of God, depart from me, I'm a sinful man, O Lord. Like, you see that thread consistently. And here we see, what's Jesus' reaction to that? Peter says, stay away from me. You don't know who I am. I'm a mess. I'm a sinful man. And Jesus says what? Don't be afraid. Come with me. Right? So his reaction from the very beginning, he chooses Peter's boat. He asks Peter to do this thing in faith. Right? Throw out your nets, even though you've caught nothing. Throw out your nets. Peter responds, I am not worthy of this. You don't know who I am. Jesus says, don't be afraid. Come with me. Again, think of the enormity of that in Peter's life from the very beginning when he's first called.
Similar scenario is
Yes.
he says, washing your feet. In that regard, very similar. I'm summarizing it. You have no part in me unless I do. So it's in that respect.
Yeah, another great place where he's brought in. Rita? Yes. Yeah, that's a really good point. And maybe the most dramatic example of what John brought up were Jesus asking Peter to find what Jesus apparently knew or thought was there. Why did he choose Peter's boat? Why, something that Jesus thought was there. He's asking Peter to kind of dig in and find. Do you love me? Don't give me the surface answer. Do you love me? All right, think about it again. Do you, the repetitiveness of that. Yeah, really good. Yes, sir.
Opposite of the first, touch and go, there's definitely some aggressiveness. To me, that relationship, is actually, to me, more between the friends who are extremely close. So when Peter is, at the time, right after his rebuke sometimes, he's not gun shy. He'll come back and say exactly what he's thinking the next time. Jesus is like, that ain't it either. so that, and so he's not scared of this. He's not scared to boldly say, I will never fail you, or I'll never, reject you, or, well, I mean, Peter, and he's also willing to cut off the dude's ear to take, to defend him. So to me, yes, absolutely. I love those 11 in the grass and touch and go. But to me, that's between those who are very close and Jesus not scared to tell, him not still scared to approach him, whether it's by walking on the water or question or whatever. To me, that shows the trust and love and friendship he has with Christ.
Well said. So this is a relationship between two people who are very close, and you definitely see that. You see the affection from both sides, I think. You definitely see Peter's affection for Jesus, but you also see Jesus' affection for Peter. Do you have something?
As I was reading about the relationship, it illustrated to me the interplay between what's our part, what do we need to do, as Christ transform us. So there are people that go to either extreme of that. Well, it's all up to me to live a pure life and to have self-control and to follow. And then there's the other extreme of Jesus saves and you can't do anything to earn it, and you can go either extreme, but their relationship showed Jesus' empowerment of Peter and his patience while Peter's faith grew, but also Peter's repentance and Peter's following and motivation to do better and motivation to repent. So it kind of shows through a relationship, through describing a relationship, it kind of shows the balance between what our responsibility is and what we need to do in forming that new creation, that part on our own.
And we probably also, to just further that a little bit, we also get the fact that Jesus' transformation of us is not a painless process. The transformation of Peter was not a painless process. The betrayal, all of the rebukes, again, transformation of Peter. How do we make that relevant to us? It's not always painless. It wasn't for Peter. Yes. Yes, well said. If there's an account that maybe struck me the most, and maybe there's a reason I put it first in our lesson, that it kind of illustrates the closeness and also the ups and downs of the relationship. It's this walking on the water episode for Matthew 14. So let's step to there for just a moment. We will spend a little bit of time in that passage. We're not going to spend all our time there, but if there is something that talks about the fact that it was up and down, that Peter was aggressive, but there was also tenderness, and that they clearly had this relationship, it's this account. And so, again, I hope you had a chance to read Matthew 14. There are parallel accounts in other Gospels. John has a parallel account in John chapter 6. I guess let me ask this question first. Why did Jesus walk on the water to these guys? Like, they were in trouble in a storm. He very easily could have, right from the shore, calmed the storm, right? I mean, if you believe anything at all about the divinity of Jesus, you know he could have calmed this storm from anywhere. Why? According to John's account, if you go to John chapter 6, he may have had to walk 2 or 3 miles on the water out to the middle of the sea to get to these guys. Why go through all that? Why not just teach the lesson when they get whatever, teach the lesson when they get back to shore? Why walk all that way in the middle of a storm on the water out to where these guys are?
Well, just to add to that real quick, the fourth watch, what's that, is it 3 morning?
Early, yeah, pre-dawn morning.
I mean, not asking you, I'm not answering your question, I'm just adding that to it.
Yes, and what do you think that adds?
Opportunities to come in the presence of Jesus or experience spiritual opportunities are going to come if really do take any time.
That's an interesting point, yeah. So,
Jesus wanted to show the disciples that he was God. He can do anything. Just have trust and faith in him. You can do the same thing.
so there must have been something, to Paul's point, there must have been something that he's trying to teach the apostles here, teach the disciples in walking out to them on the water, and his divinity or trust in him or whatever it was. And maybe we don't know. Maybe we don't know why. Maybe Peter, changed the whole, changed the narrative with what he did. And what did Peter do?
He asked him if he can walk also.
He said, if it's you, tell me to come to you. Okay? I think Jesus' response there is interesting. And it's pretty short, but what's Jesus' response?
Come.
Yeah. Why is that interesting? What? Yes.
Plan, but it's also, I think, a bigger picture of the deliverer, the
Can you picture Peter throwing one leg over the edge of this boat and kind of give it one of these? Just think about that scene. Actually, I guess if he would have, given the way that we know about the scene, he probably wasn't that uneasy about it. Probably just leapt out and took off. That's kind of the picture that we're given. But he's again, this is not about Peter, but Peter's the only disciple that we know that was able to do this thing in Scripture, this incredible thing. So that says something about him. First of all, and what does it say about Jesus? That Jesus invited him to do it. And then when he gets to Jesus or near Jesus, we're not told specifically, but I think one version Tara pointed out, it does say when there must have been some distance still to where Jesus was. He walked for some distance on the water to Jesus. He came, which account is that? Is it Matthew? Yeah, when he came to Jesus, so he'd gone some distance. He came, interesting, it wasn't until he got to Jesus that this happened. And then what happened? We know the story, right? He became uneasy, or he took his eyes off Jesus, whatever however you want to describe that account, and he began to sink. I think, again, this lesson's often about Peter, but as we think about Jesus, what do we learn about Jesus from this account and Jesus' reaction to Peter's failure of faith here? Reached out his hand, first thing he did. He didn't say, "Where's your faith now, big boy?" The first thing he did was he reached out his hand and he got him. And we're not told the specifics of that, but it must have been either he held him up or he pulled him back to where he was standing. We're not told 100% sure. I'm not sure if they walked back to the boat necessarily, or we're not given that detail. But somehow, because again, Peter was a swimmer. This must have been rough water. We're given another account. He stripped down and jumped in the water. He wasn't afraid of the water. But somehow in rough water, Jesus got him to a position where he was no longer afraid. And there's this incredibly interesting phrase that he says to Peter. What does he say was the first thing he says to him, I think, in Matthew? "O ye of little faith," which, again, I'm no Greek scholar, but if you That's really just kind of a compound word that Jesus kind of invents and puts together. It's little in faith. And it's one word. O ye of little faith is just one word in Greek. It's almost like this endearing little nickname that he gives when people struggle. It says, little faith. I'll think about it like an Indian name or like little faith. Why did you waver? Why did you doubt? I don't think that we should, at least based on that, my reading of understanding of that, I don't think we should see that as a rebuke or as a condescending, nothing of that sort, but as a very endearing reach out for help. Little faith, why did you doubt? What caused you to doubt? What caused you to waver?
As you're describing that, it reminds me of when our kids were learning. Oh, no, you can do it, and they're all the way over there, and they kind of toddle to you, and they get to you, and they fall. Or they learn to walk, and then you put them in the grass for the first time. I put Jackson in the sandbox for the first time. And me saying, it's all right. Come on. Not as in a rebuke, but just in a teaching, like encouraging, I know you can do it type of scenario where he knows Peter's heart. And so in that encouraging kind of a parent-child almost kind of thing, like I'm teaching you to do this here. I'm teaching you to have this faith so that later when you need boldness, you will look back on this and remember the lesson that you learned here.
I think there is a lesson about how Jesus responds. Like, Peter stepped out, right? He stepped out, and it would have been easy, the human side of us, sometimes we want to, when somebody steps out and tries to do something maybe beyond their ability, and then they fall short, it's easy to want to belittle, it's easy to want to say, I think that was, you got a little too big for your britches, whatever, that kind of idea. Jesus, he never condemned the fact that he wanted to try. He doesn't condescend to him because he wasn't able to complete the task. I just think there's something about Jesus' reaction there that's really, really poignant and important as we think about who God is in this context. Peter's faith went up and down, right? Somebody, go ahead.
I was just also thinking about how this is the way how we are through temptation. Okay, what I'm trying to get at is the waters and stuff like this in that ancient time, water gods and chaos in general was always associated with waters in the sea. The top gods were always the storm gods. We all know that about Baal, right? This time, empire, they would take over areas, they would just incorporate their gods. So at this time, that storm god was, right? And also in the Jewish mind, storms, water, again, was always associated with chaos. You see this in the Bohu in Hebrew, Genesis 1, that's described. And it's always described in the Old Testament as God being the one who's over and controlling these things as against Baal, who's not in control. So you hear you see Christ as the one who's in control of the waters and the chaos, right? And so it's here Peter's going out, and he's, because of Christ, is also trampling down on the powers of this. And in the Old Testament, God is called Yom. In Psalm 93, it says, the seas have lifted up, the Lord, the seas have lifted their voice, the seas have lifted their pounding waves. Mightier than the thunder of the great waters, mightier than the breakers of the sea, the Lord on high is mighty. And in those original Hebrew, it actually talks about the goddess Yam, who's the goddess of the storm and the sea. So here you see Christ being depicted as the one who's in charge of the powers, right? The demons and those who are in charge of Christ. And Peter's the one who's also invited to do that. As a human now, is incorporated into control of, through the power of Christ, the demons and the chaos, right? Through Christ we can kind of overcome all these things. So, great depiction as Peter is all identified with him as we've been all talking. Now he sees the winds and the waves. He sees the chaos as if they're controlling him, right? He goes back into this human stage praying with him as he's walking on the water. And he doubts. He's like, wait, I'm not that important. Wait, does God really love me? Does he really see me that way? These waves are going to destroy me. And Christ is like, why? Not see it. You were trampling over chaos. You were in charge through me.
Yeah.
Right? And so it's just and so a lot of the first century, when they're hearing the story and reading the story, all of that's in their mind as well.
And it's all good. One of the points that made me think of is, as Peter is walking toward Jesus, how do you think that he would have, what would he have said in that moment? You know, if you put yourself in Peter's shoes in that moment, walking toward Jesus, what would he have said about the waves and the wind and the storm and the chaos?
They don't bother me.
I don't think he said anything, right? They like disappeared. They didn't exist. That wasn't on his mind, clearly. Like all the chaos around him, all the storm, like again, the metaphor we all get, all the storms of life around him, he didn't have an opinion on one way or another. He was oblivious to them. He had his eyes on something else. Anyway, I think we've all heard that lesson, but man, it's powerful when you think about it. It wasn't until he recognized again that those things might have control over him that he began to have a problem.
He's as indifferent in this case as he is sleeping on
Yes, yeah, and Jesus sleeping on in that case, yeah, which is another one we could have used. So from that, anything else on the kind of the walking on the water passage? So from that passage, which I just think is really affectionate, at least that's the way I think I read that. You don't have to go too much farther until you get to Matthew 16, and there's a very different part of this relationship in Matthew 16. What context is important here? What has just happened in Matthew 16? Just in the few verses previous that Matthew retells. Yeah, that very famous passage in Matthew 16 where Peter says that you are the Messiah. That incredibly significant profession, I believe that you are the Messiah. We read about in kind of verses 13 through 20. And Matthew seems to make that point intentionally, that it's from that moment that Peter recognizes him as the Messiah. Then we go to verse 21. He says, from that time, from that confession, from that recognition of Peter that he's the Messiah, Jesus began to show his disciples he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things from the elders and chief priests and scribes and be killed and on the third day be raised. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him and said, far be it from you, Lord, this shall never happen to you. But he turned and said to Peter, get behind me, Satan. You are a hindrance to me. You are a hindrance. You are a stumbling block. The NET. You are a stumbling block to me. You're not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of man. So, as affectionate as Jesus seemed to be in Matthew 14, this is pretty stinging here in Matthew 16. So, what do you think's the difference?
Jesus is teaching, telling him to, look, I got a thing to do, let me do it.
I got a thing to do, let me do it. Yeah, I think that's true. I think that's true.
There's a difference here. We got a test of faith here where obviously Peter and all of them had issues at times. Christ is trying to lay out what he's got to do to save everybody. They don't clearly know this at this time. What's going to happen? This is going to happen. What have I said that hasn't come to pass yet or hasn't happened? You're trying to say not going to place. So to me, major difference here in the fact that he's just, we all fail, we all mess up. Peter was on the right path, messed up on the walk to Christ and across the water.
Yes.
But in this one, he's literally saying, no, this is a plan that is beyond anything you can possibly imagine. Nothing you say or do is going to prevent this.
I got out my phone because I forgot the exact words here, but the words that he says to Peter, hypago satanas. He uses those exact words one other time in the New Testament. Got any ideas where? Exactly the same words. When he says to Satan, "Get thee hence, Satan," when he is rebuking Satan during the temptation, he uses the exact words that he says to Peter here. Any idea why? Why were those similar? Yes. And both, remember when we talked about the temptation, what was at the core of that? The core of that was there's another way. There's another way out of this. You don't have to do the cross. You don't have to, go through the plan as directed. The temptation that Satan was offering is there's a different way to do this, right? And perhaps in Jesus' mind, at least in the words he used, Peter is kind of offering the same temptation here. Because I don't know that one of the things that stuck out to me that I made a note of that was interesting to me here was who is the stumbling block and to who in this passage? In this passage, who's the stumbling block? Peter. To who? Think about being a stumbling block to Jesus. How could you possibly be a stumbling block to Jesus? What does that even mean? So what do you take that to mean? How was Peter a stumbling block to Jesus?
Peter was on the water and he said that he was focused on Jesus, oblivious to other ways out of the water, so he started to doubt. He said, focused on God's will, he was oblivious to the other ways out, but when Satan through Peter voices this distraction over here. Hey, remember, there's other ways over here. He's saying, get behind me or leave me alone. He's saying, I need to focus on God's plan and be oblivious to these other ways out, because he knew he had those other ways out. And in spending time with the Father, he had focused on his will. And so bringing that up again, hey, there's another way. You don't have to do it this way. Aware of that he had that power.
Sam?
It seems kind of like harsh words to Peter, but I've been on the receiving end. Have those harsh ideas harshly squished out of you. Peter had this same mindset. Regarding it would have been a greater temptation. Potentially.
No, it's a really good point.
So what Peter needed when he had a problem.
I'm going to focus on something that both these guys said, and Tara may have said it directly. Satan, through Peter, is putting a temptation in front of Jesus here. I don't know if we think about this passage in that way, but I think that's what's happening. And like many of us, perhaps at times, Peter is an unwitting, doing the will of Satan here by putting this earthly idea, this earthly temptation in front of Jesus, that Jesus would call him a hindrance, call him a stumbling block, in the same way that he talked about being tempted by Satan in the wilderness. Anyway, I think that Jesus made that connection. I think we should probably make it too. Yes, ma'am. Pretty clear, yes.
But he couldn't reconcile the view that, this time I think Peter's mind was probably on things of the world and earthly values.
Yes.
And probably the rest of it
Yes. And I think Judy makes a great point there. There's many times that we might say, man, Peter he was out of left field there. In reality, he just said the thing that they were all thinking. Peter just had the guts to say it many times. But in this case in particular, and Judy's point that it seems pretty clear that Peter had the wrong conception of the Messiah, which kind of, he was willing to accept that Jesus was the Messiah, But his conception of what that was led him, that wrong idea led him to this idea that this is not the right way. Yes?
Also like that, obviously loves Jesus, like his fleshly human self, he loves that. Have one of your closest friends tell you that they're gonna die,
Be tortured and die.
be tortured and die. I'm just like, how do you even, isn't your first reaction, and it's a human reaction, but absolutely not. No, you've done so much good, you're amazing, like you can't leave.
Yes.
And I mean, obviously that's the thoughts of men, but like you said, he's saying exactly what all of them had to be thinking.
Absolutely. And probably what I would have said if I'd had the guts to say it.
Love Peter too, and so the temptation, Satan could get to him personally. Love to, don't leave us here. And you see that prayer in John 17 that Jesus loves these men, and so to have someone he loves saying, "You don't have to do it that way. You can do it another way," it would be the same temptation in a different form. I think.
Of course we would say, Jesus, don't leave us. That can't be. Like that's of course, that's what we would say. And Jesus' reaction to that was what it was. I think, again, we often talk about that from Peter's perspective. Think about it from Jesus' perspective. From one of your closest, the close people that you are closest to, hearing, don't do it that way, don't leave us, that's incredibly hard. That from the human side of you, it helps me understand why he would call that. Again, Jesus having that perfect spiritual vision. Hey, Peter, you got to understand that way of thinking is an absolute stumbling block to what I'm trying to achieve here. That is the wrong way to do this, and it's a stumbling block to what I'm trying to achieve. It sounds harsh, but I think maybe because it hurt Jesus in that relationship is why that it had to be that rebuke coming that way.
I want to get your thoughts on, I'm resident, the opportunity that Satan had, maybe the last opportunity, about altering the plan didn't resonate. Why would he pray that I will let this cut past?
Yes.
Because he, lack of faith. It's like, God, can you accomplish what you want to accomplish in a different way? So to say that these little phrases don't resonate with Jesus,
That's really profound. Yeah, that he willing to do the Father's will despite these misgivings, and how many of these misgivings came from things like this. Can this cup pass from me? They don't want to do without, like all of those thoughts in Jesus' human brain. I think they have to be there in the garden.
Isn't that Christ's ultimate goal? The whole time he's telling the apostles, where Jesus the entire time is completely aligned. Completely aligned.
Yes.
So he's saying, Christ is saying, you're not following me, the person. You're here to align with God's plan.
Well said.
Not with me. So if you're aligned with God's plan, whatever I'm indicating that is, align with that and don't cause a block for that.
Yeah. Don't let what your flesh wants get in the way of what God's plan. Man, how profound is that? That Jesus is teaching there.
And the most humbling thing, or one of the most humbling things as I was studying this was all Peter had given up, his livelihood, his possibly family. He's made the confession that Jesus is the Messiah. Like he's done a lot of these things in obedience, but still, that wasn't. It has to be a transformation of how we see things. So, how important is praying for spiritual vision in our Christian walk? That we can look back and say, well, I've heard the word and I've believed and confessed and repented and been baptized and I'm living faithfully, but is our flesh tempting us away from spiritual good that's out there as part of God's plan, maybe because we're resistant, because it's going to be uncomfortable, or it's going to cost us something, or we just see
Or-
it in a human way and we need God's help to see it in a spiritual eyes.
Is that friendship more important, right? And that kind of the core. Did you have something? Sorry, I thought I saw your hand up. Is that friendship more important than God's will, being aligned with God's will. Anyway.
Us knowing that he is God in the flesh. And it's hard for us to understand. They didn't know yet exactly what was going to happen. But wouldn't we think, why would a man that could do miracles allow the people to kill him,
Yeah.
to do what they did to him?
Yeah.
You know, that's the love that he has.
Yeah.
But it's just inconceivable that we can't understand it.
Yeah.
And I'm sure that he thought, because he'd seen miracles, why would you allow yourself to be killed?
And there's at least, to that point, there's at least one other time where Peter makes a very similar, at least in my mind, I connect to a very similar reaction, right? To where does Peter have a very fleshly reaction to Jesus being taken? Right? He's ready to take up arms, literally. I mean, he does take up arms, literally, in the defense of Jesus. And the human-driven side of us wants to say what about that reaction of Peter? Attaboy, finally. Somebody, some backbone around here, got some gumption, going to take up for Jesus, right? That's what the human side of us, that's a natural reaction from the human side of us. Well, he actually cut him off and then denied him. But how does Jesus respond to that? Again, we might talk about Peter's side. How does Jesus respond to that action of Peter, that very human, defensive of my friend action? What does Jesus say about it?
You live by the sword, you die by the sword.
And what do we think he means by that? So that phrase that we're familiar with, and it's not in John, it's in the other account. Those who live by the sword will die by the sword. It says in John's account, put your sword in its sheath, shall I not drink the cup the Father has given me. What do we learn about Jesus in that? Yeah, and that's the point I was going to make. You talk about the way that this situation could have spiraled and escalated, probably not to as much to Jesus' detriment as to everyone else, as to the apostles that were with him. That could have spiraled very much out of control. The diffusion there is really, really interesting. And the impact. You know, why did Jesus diffuse the situation? There's at least two reasons. Yeah.
I was going to say, I don't know if it could have been a teaching moment. Just kind of saying it's time.
Yeah.
Maybe he.
Yeah.
Well, that was right after he had prayed in the garden, right? So if this cup, if you will, if this cup pass from me, he talked about before how he fought the battle in prayer. And when they come to arrest him, it's evident that this cup is not going to pass, and so your will be done. Now you show me your will, and now I'm going to do the thing.
I think this is.
He is prepared in prayer.
I agree with both those. So it's interesting, the only time you really see Jesus struggle is in prayer. When he actually has to face with somebody else, he's been strengthened because his struggle was in prayer. I think that's significant. But also to Nathan's point, this was another example, I think, of Peter being a little bit of a stumbling block. It had to be a temptation to say, you know, maybe we could fight this. It had to be in that moment. Yes.
In these examples we've been talking about here of attributes that Peter exhibited, there's still Peters in this world today.
Absolutely.
And Jesus showed an exceptional amount of patience with him. Every one of them, whether it was walking on water, whether it was cutting off the mouth of his ear, or whether it was denying him at the cross.
Yes.
And maybe the lesson from that is characteristics who are really anxious to say and do things that turns out to be a disaster. Christ was patient with without any fear or hesitation. But he, you know, all Christ had to do there at his trial was to look at him after he had denied him.
Yes.
And that seemed to kind of ring the bell where Peter knew he needed to bell.
You rang the bell.
So
Where he knew that he needed to calm down and be more thoughtful.
I think, not surprisingly, our elder hit it dead center here. All of, you know, how many times am I Peter? The person who speaks a little too fast, thinks he's a little smarter than he is, you know, wants to be the first one to do something maybe not that intelligent. Jesus easily could have been condescending to him, could have been belittling to him, could have said, hey, you just need to shut up for a while. You never hear any of that stuff. That the incredible patience in the teaching, in the formation of Peter, so that we get the Peter of Acts 2, who was the one who was willing to stand up, and what was, you know, a pretty treacherous little situation there too, and uneasy, and a lot of unrest in the city, the one who was willing to stand up and say the thing. All of that training, Jesus never tried to push him out because of his impetuousness, just tried to harness it and train him. Like, that's so good. So we're talking about demons next time. That'll be fun. Sunday morning, let's Jesus in the removal of demons. Thanks everybody for your comments tonight.